Hi, my name's Justin Shelf and I'm the founder and engineering lead at PatchMyPC. We develop a third-party patch management solution that integrates into Microsoft Configuration Manager. Prior to my current role, I was also a premier field engineer at Microsoft supporting Config Manager. In this video, based on our recent Twitter poll, we're going to be talking about the backup and recovery process of a Config Manager site, more specifically the site server. So we'll go ahead and get started. We are going to run through the full process of performing a backup as well as a complete recovery of our site system. So the first thing that we'll cover is kind of the different scenarios or options that you have to actually perform your initial backup of your site. So looking at our backup documentation, we go ahead and zoom in here. There's really two different options that you can do for performing a site backup. The first one's going to be you can use the built-in Config Manager maintenance task that's going to perform a backup of your site database, as well as a few additional files and folders relevant to your site. The second option is that you can have a backup performed outside of Config Manager for your site database and perform a recovery based on that backup. So for example, you could use a SQL Server maintenance plan or something like Data Protection Manager to back up your site database. We'll be talking about both of these options in today's video. Now, another interesting thing that came out in the 1806 build of Current Branch is this new feature called high availability. Essentially, it allows you to have two site servers running at once, one active and one passive. And in the event that your active site server went down, you could just have your passive one and promote that to become active. So that one is a feature that can help you with high availability and possibly reduce the impact if you ever did have a site server that went down. This is going to be a separate topic that I'm going to talk about in the future. For today's video, we're just going to be talking about the core backup and recovery, which is still going to be a good thing to understand, and you want to make sure that you still have a good backup and recovery plan, even if you were using the high availability feature, of course, in 1806. All right, so first thing we want to talk about is what actually gets backed up or what needs to get backed up in order to perform a recovery. So if you went to the option and used the default maintenance plan option, Config Manager is going to automatically back up based on the schedule that you define your site database. So that's the biggest piece. We absolutely need that in order to restore. It's going to back up a few registry keys related to the installation and a few files and folders. That's going to include the things like your logs directory and your inboxes, but neither of these two are required to do the recovery. And then lastly, it does back up your CD.Latest folder. So the CD.Latest folder in Current Branch is going to be where the current installation, so if we look at our installation of SCCM, we can see that this CD.Latest is just the installation for the current build that we have installed. So in our case, it's 1810. So this would be something that gets automatically backed up so that when we did our restore, we would be able to actually perform the reinstallation of the site and point to the recovery using that CD.Latest from the build that we were previously running. So that's an important piece to back up. Even if you're using an alternative backup like a SQL maintenance plan, you still want to make sure that we have that CD.Latest folder and back that up. A quick note, it is recommended to run a backup for SQL at least every 5 days, just because that's the way the scheduling is for retention tracking, to make sure that you have your backup within that period of days. You want to make sure that you're running it at least every 5 days. Another thing that we will be covering in this video is this AfterBackup.bat. So this is a file that we can have within our directory for our backup inbox, and it's going to automatically run any commands that you have within this batch file automatically in the site maintenance task. So for example, let's say that SCCM is going to back up your site database, is going to back up the CD.Latest, but there's some other things that we want to include in our backup that isn't natively done within the maintenance task. So things like your content library, maybe you have your package sources on your site server, any of those additional folders that we want to include, we could include in this AfterBackup.bat file, and that could automatically run and back up any additional content that we want to use. All right, so that looks good. I don't think there's a whole lot else I need to cover here. Let's take a look. There we go. So here's just an example command of how you could run a RoboCopy within the AfterBackup.bat to do something like mirror a local directory on your server to a remote backup. So this is something that we'll actually be performing here in our video. Okay, and so here we go. So here's some stuff that I want to talk about. So your default maintenance task is not going to back up everything that you really need. So for example, the content library on your site server is not going to be backed up using the default maintenance task. You would want to make sure that you have another plan to back up that content library for SCCM to a remote share. Another thing, if you're using your package source file, so things like packages, applications, software update groups, if any of your package source files are also shared out from your site server, you're going to want to make sure that you also include those in case you have to rebuild the site server. Your config manager site still has access to any of those source locations that you use for your packages. So for example, they do have a command where you can kind of analyze what packages are out there that are using a certain path. So I'll include this SQL script within my description in the video below. But just to show you how you can kind of validate if you are using any content source packages and if you're pointing to your site server. So I'm going to go ahead and run the script. So what we're basically doing, we're saying, let's select all of our packages, the ID, the name, and the path from our packages, but let's look at where the source path is like whack SCCM3. So in my scenario, SCCM3 is our site server that is running our host. So let me go ahead and execute this on my SCCM database. And for example, we can see that all these built-in ones we can basically ignore because they're going to get restored with the site backup. But we do have a software update package that is pointing out to a local UNC path on my site server. So if you don't host your packages remotely, you will want to make sure that you also include any of that source content within your backup as well. So the first option that we're going to look at is we're going to go ahead and just use the built-in site maintenance task to perform the backup. Now, the advantage of this is it's pretty simple. You can do it directly from the console, but you don't get any type of compression for your SQL database. So depending on how much free space there is, your database backup could be pretty large without the compression feature as compared to if you were to do it via SQL Management Studio and just set up like a backup job directly in SQL where it could compress that database as well. That's one of the advantages that a SQL backup has that the maintenance task would not perform. So the first thing that we'll kind of go over is how we would actually set that up. Now I have on a remote server, so we have this remote server here. I've already created a backup folder and I've already shared that out. Now within the share, I've already granted permissions to the computer object of my site server. So our SCCM3 server that's going to be performing the backup, since it runs under the computer context or the system account, we want to make sure that computer account has full control to this backup folder so we can create the backup. Now I have also added my SQL Server account that's running my SQL service because we're also going to perform a SQL backup using the built-in plan in SQL. So we've also assigned that service account permissions as well. So that looks good. So if we come back to our site server and if we look at our site maintenance, and we can go ahead and look at the backup site server task. And the first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and browse out to that remote UNC path that we shared out for our backups that we're going to use to actually perform the backup and host that content. So within here, here's our UNC path. So we're going to point this to ASUS Backups Site PR3. Now the default backup is going to create a new folder called site code. So our site code is PR3 and then backup. So we'll just go ahead and define the root folder here. So we'll just copy this. and we'll enable that task, and we're going to set the option to use a UNC path so we don't have to worry about doing any type of copying from the local machine to a UNC path afterwards. We're just going to go ahead and browse out and paste that path directly in here. So it's going to save it directly to that UNC path. So we're going to run it between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m. and we're going to run it on Monday, Wednesday, and Fridays. I'm also going to enable the option to enable alerts if it fails. So we'll go ahead and apply that and then do OK. All right, so that looks good. Now, in order for us to back up some of the additional content that's not going to be included, that's where we can make use of that AfterBackup.bat file, so we can do things like copy additional content folders from this machine. So first thing I'm going to show you is our content library. So we already mentioned that the content library is not going to get backed up. So for my machine, the content library exists on the J drive. So we've got our content library here. That's going to be where any files that you import using like a package, an application, software update package, all of that data gets put in the content library on your site server, and that's going to be the path that it uses whenever it distributes that content to remote DPs. So this is going to contain any content or binary file that you've ever created within any package source location. So we're going to want to make sure that we are, backing this content up, because if we recall, the content library is not going to be included in the default maintenance task. We want to make sure that we back that up separately. The next thing that we want to look at is that sources directory. So if you remember, we had some packages shared out, and it was shared out from the site server. So if we look at our iDrive, this sources folder, this is where that UNC path, so if we go whack SCCM3 and look at our sources, this is where our application sources as well as our software update package that we saw. This is going to be where it's actually being shared from. So we also want to make sure that we back up that source folder as well, so that in the event that we had to recover our server, we could share that folder out when we recover it. Now, of course, if you have your content sources on some remote UNC path or file share that is not on your site server, you wouldn't have to worry about backing that up because it's already remote. And then finally, for my site, just for this scenario, I am actually running a lot of my site system roles on my site server. So for example, we can see that we have a lot of common roles on here. But more specifically, the one that we have is the software update point. So we are going to want to make sure that we also back up our WSUS database as well as our content for WSUS. So within my WSUS, if you're not sure where your WSUS content is, you could quickly go out to HKey local machine, software, Microsoft, update services, server, and then setup. Within the setup, it will tell you your content directory for the WSUS content. So it looks like this one is on JWSUS. So if we go here and look at this, this is going to contain any of our WSUS content. So for example, things like EULAs would be stored here. If you're publishing third-party updates, that content will also get stored in the WSUS content folder. So we want to also make sure that we include that in our backup. And then back to our backup guide. The other thing, if you are using SCUP, I think at this point, most people have probably moved away from SCUP if they're doing third-party updates, and they're probably using either the native 1806 feature, or if they're using our solution, Patch My PC, they're probably using our publishing service for publishing updates. But in the scenario that you are using SCUP, you would want to make sure that you grab your local SCUP database file from your user profile that we can see here. All right, so what we've determined in our environment, we're going to want to make sure that we copy our content library, our WSUS content folder, as well as our package source, since that's hosted on our site server. Now, in order to automatically back this up, along with our config manager site backup task, what we're going to do is use that AfterBackup.bat. So if we go ahead and look at our inboxes, so back in our documentation, if we recall that, using the AfterBackup here, in order to actually make use of this, we have to create the batch file, right? So we have AfterBackup.bat, And that if that file exists within our backup, so Smsbkup.box within our inboxes, it's going to automatically initiate that after each backup task runs. All right, so let me go ahead and go to that inbox for the backup. And let me go ahead and delete what I had there before, just so we can start clean. Now within my backup location, let me see if I still have that here. I've already created some scripts. So we have our AfterBackup.bat that I want to use within my default backup task. So I'm going to go ahead and paste that directly in our inbox. And what we're essentially doing here, it's very simple. It's just a batch file, and that's what SCCM uses. We're just basically doing a RoboCopy from our local directory. So there's our content library that we want to back up. Here's our WSUS Content folder. And here's that sources folder for our packages. So we're basically just RoboCopying that to the UNC path. So back over there on that backup, right? And we are using the MIR switch. So we're basically mirroring the local directory into that UNC path. So that's going to basically copy everything exactly how it exists locally. And if anything changes, any future backup that runs would just do whatever incremental changes have occurred since that previous backup. So this is extremely simple, but I mean, for what you want to do here, it really works perfectly fine. We also log out the results to a log file. So we're writing everything out and piping that to a log so we can see all the RoboCopy files, everything that's going on within a log file. So by having that within our Smsbkup.box, whenever a maintenance task performs a site backup, it's going to automatically copy that content as well. All right, so that looks good. So let's just go ahead and browse out to that directory. And if we take a look, so when we run our backup, we're pointing it out to the backup content. So if we take a quick look back at that RoboCopy, it's going to copy everything here to that PR3 backup content folder. So in order to go ahead and run a test, when Config Manager actually performs a site backup during that period of time that we define and on the day that we define, it's essentially just launching the SMS site backup service. So we can see it set to manual. So whenever this gets triggered, it's going to automatically start a backup. So I'm going to go ahead and manually run that. And if we go ahead and take a look at our log files, we can see the Smsbkup.log. That's going to log out all the status of the Config Manager backup. So for example, here in a few minutes, we should see it copying the database files to that UNC path. And then we'll also see it doing a copy of like the CD.Latest folder. And then at the end, we'll see it launch our batch file. So I'll go ahead and pause it while we wait for that to copy. All right, so it took about probably 3 or 4 minutes for everything to get copied here. But here at the end, we can see that it successfully started AfterBackup.bat. So if we go ahead and zoom out of here, and if we take a quick look at our command prompt, we should see our batch file running. So here we are. We can see that it did in fact automatically run our batch. So that's currently running those RoboCopy commands. If we look back at our inboxes, since we piped out our logs, so we piped out the RoboCopy output to our log file, we can see pretty much everything happening for the file copy. So we can see all these new files it's creating. Now this first one is obviously going to take a little bit longer because there hasn't been a copy performed yet. So if we come back and look at our folder structure for the backup, we can see that it's currently backing up the content library. So after that, it's going to go ahead and do WSUS, and then it's going to perform the source folder copy. So we'll just kind of monitor that. While we wait for that to complete, we can go ahead and check out what happened for our site maintenance backup. So using the default maintenance task, so that created this PR3 backup folder. So we can see that it got that CD.Latest. It got our database, and then it got a few different things from our site server. So we look at the CD.Latest. That's going to be that folder structure that we could use to perform our reinstallation. The site database, that's going to be our MDF and our log file for our config manager site database. So in my case, I did have a few additional secondary files that I created. So you might have some, or for you, it might just be the MDF and then the LDF for the actual database backup. So that's going to be the full database that we could restore. And then the site server, these are a few additional directories that we have. So for example, your inboxes. So it's going to grab some of the active inboxes that might be processing data at the backup. Also the log files of the site server. So these aren't really required for you to restore. These are just a few additional things that the default task will get you. It does also include the log file of the backup that was performed. All right, now one other thing that I do want to talk about is this recovery prerequisites. So what I've done within my environment, I've already downloaded some of the prerequisites that I would need in order to reinstall SCCM in the event that I had to rebuild my site server. So for example, I've already got SQL Server downloaded and ready to install. I've already got the Windows 10 ADK. I have also created some documentation about my current server, which is basically just some screenshots. So for example, I took a screenshot of the disk management layout. So just kind of what's going on that previous server to understand, how I might want to rebuild my disk structure. I also took a screenshot of SQL Server Configuration Manager. More specifically, you want to make sure that you understand if your SQL Server service is running under a service account or just the system account. And then our SQL Server agent. So you want to, just kind of understand, do you want to reinstall SQL with a specific service account if you had to rebuild, or maybe you're just using the default system account on the local machine. So a good idea to probably have a screenshot of that if you're performing some backup documents. I also took a screenshot of the current SQL Server version. So this can be helpful to know what was currently running before the backup and recovery. So in our case, there is a helpful website that, let me try to bring that up really quick. Here we go. So SQLServerBuilds.blogspot.com. If you just want to try to analyze like what your current install version is with what does that actually translate to. So in our case, it looks like it ends in 305 or 3025.34. So for example, if we came over to our website, so 3025.34, so we could quickly search out and we can see that we currently have SQL Server 2017 cumulative update 6. Now, in the event that you wanted to recover to a new upgraded operating system and or SQL Server instance number, so maybe you want to go from SQL 2014 to 2017, as well as maybe Windows Server 2016 to 2019, for example, it is supported to do a in-place upgrade when you're doing your backup and recovery. So for example, we can use the backup and recovery to perform a SQL upgrade. So you could go to a new major version, and that is a supported upgrade scenario. Next thing is just the disk layout. So just understand kind of, what's going on with my current disk on my site server. Any UNC shares, so all the default ones we can kind of ignore. So these will all be recreated within the SCCM reinstall. This sources one, this is the one that's custom that we made sure that we backed up. And then these three are related to WSUS, so they're going to automatically be restored when we reinstall WSUS and restore our content folder. So that looks pretty good here. And then finally, I just took a screenshot of my site server that we're going to be backing up and just the current roles that we had installed for that. So just understand what was previously there to make sure that we know how it's going to recover. All right, so looking at the log output from that batch file, it looks like we are now complete. So let's go ahead and take a quick look at the backup directory that we had here. So there we go. We can see that we have our content library, we have our sources, and our WSUS folder that we included in that RoboCopy. So this would, of course, rerun every time that site maintenance task kicks off, which would be Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and it would copy any new content that might have been added to the content library, the sources, or WSUS folder. So that looks good. Now, so that would cover, if you wanted to do the default site maintenance task, that would kind of be what that will look like. So we've got our task that does our database, the CD.Latest, as well as our custom RoboCopy using the AfterBackup.bat that does any additional content that you might need to back up. Now for WSUS, if you wanted to back that up and recover that, if you were running a software update point role on your site server, you would also want to make sure that you set up a SQL maintenance plan to back up the database for WSUS, because that would not be included in the default site backup task that includes the SCCM database. So just taking a quick look here. So the CMPR3, that's our site database, that got backed up using the default site backup, but we still need to get our WSUS database. And depending on if your report server is installed on your site server, you might want to also back that up, primarily if you had any type of custom reports. If you're using just the default out of the box SCCM reports, there wouldn't really be a big need to back this up, because when the SSRS role reinstalls, it would just recopy all those reports anyways. But if you did have custom reports, probably not a bad idea to go ahead and back up that database. So in order to back that up, we're going to go ahead and go down here to management and then maintenance plans. Now, in order for our maintenance plan to run, we do want to make sure under our SQL Server Configuration Manager that the SQL agent is set to start up automatically. So by default, if you just left the default SQL options, this might be set to manual. So you want to make sure that that's automatic so that you can perform a backup, since that runs under the SQL Server agent account. So we're going to go ahead and do a new maintenance plan. Now, this could also be, so if you wanted to use the second option for SCCM to just back up the database directly using a SQL maintenance plan instead of the default site maintenance task, this would be the same option. And within this wizard, I'll actually include the WSUS database as well as the SCCM database. So this could be the option 2 that you could use to just do a native SQL backup if you wanted to use that method instead. So I have already created a folder within my backup for this UNC path called SQL Backup. So we're going to go ahead and copy that path, and we'll just call this backup. So we're going to perform a full backup, and we are going to run a cleanup task. So these are the two options that we need here. We'll do next here. The databases that we want to back up, in our case, we are going to do our SCCM database. Now, if you were using the site maintenance task, you of course would not have to do this using the SQL maintenance plan we're doing here. This would be just if you wanted to use this method instead of that. And of course, we do want the SUS DB because that would not be included regardless. So we want to make sure that we have a maintenance plan that's going to back that up. In my case, I don't have any type of custom reports, so I could just rebuild that. I don't see a need to back up the report server database. There we go. Now, under the destination, we want to change that from the default backup path, which is most likely local, to that UNC path. Now, you will need to make sure that if your SQL Server account that's running the agent, the SQL Server agent, if that's running under a custom account, you need to make sure that account has write permissions to that UNC share. So in my case, I am using a domain account and I've already assigned that permissions. Okay. So that looks good. It's going to be a .back for the file extension of the database. For the options, I think I'm okay with just leaving all of the default options here, and we'll do next here. Now for the cleanup, we're going to say that we're going to clean up and delete backup files within our backup folder. So we're going to paste that same path. We're going to automatically delete any of the backups. So we want to include that .back extension because that's how they get backed up. And we're going to say if they're older than 2 weeks old. So essentially we should be running 3 backups a week. So this should retain about 6 database backups before they start getting purged out. There we go. And let me just see if I actually set a schedule here. I missed that option. Okay, so I did miss the schedule option. So we're going to go ahead and run this on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, just like the maintenance plan we had. That looks good. And let's just say we're going to start this at 4 a.m. Now, you know, if you did want to go this route instead of SCCM site maintenance task, you would only have to do this one and disable that maintenance task. So that looks good. So we've already got our, there we go, we've got our database backup. Let's just verify that retained. Oh, looks like it overrid it. So let's go ahead and select that again. Paste in our UNC path. We're going to say we want to automatically delete any of those backup files that are older than 2 weeks. And that looks good. Now, if you want to write out the log file for this task to like a standard path, you could change that from the default path if you wanted to. So we'll do next here and then finish. All right. So just to validate this works, we're going to go ahead and kick off the first one. So we're going to go ahead and click execute. And let's just see if we have our database files backing up here. All right, there we go. It looks like the backup is now complete. We have our SCCM database as well as our WSUS database, and it's saved out to that UNC path. So that looks good. Now, let's say you did want to go with that second method for performing your backup. If we go ahead and look at my scripts, we do, so in addition to that AfterBackup.bat, I do also have this custom backup. The only difference between the custom backup and the AfterBackup that we're using with SCCM is we are doing one additional folder copy. So we're copying that CD.Latest folder, and we're backing that up to our UNC path. All right, so let's say that we wanted to disable that default maintenance task. So let me go over here. Let's say you just, you want to use the default SQL backup because it's better compression. You have a little bit more flexibility over that. So let's come back to our site maintenance. And let's say that we decide we want to go with option 2. So I'll just disable that. And essentially what we're going to do is we're still just use a simple batch file. That's as good as anything else for just doing a simple RoboCopy. So we're going to go ahead and copy this custom backup. And I'll include all of these script files within the video description as well. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy this to my D drive. And we're going to run custom backup. Here we go. So let's say that you wanted to run this on a schedule as well. We could just create a simple task scheduler. So we're going to go ahead and create a new basic task and just call it SCCM Content Backup. We're going to run this weekly. We're going to run it Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, just like our SQL backup. We'll run this one at 5 a.m. instead of 4. There we go, AM. So we're going to just start a program. We're simply going to run that batch file. So just paste directly into that. And we are going to open the properties after this as well. So instead of running this under my account and when I'm logged in, we're going to say we want to run it whether or not a user is logged in and with highest privileges. And instead of running it under my Justin account, we're going to go ahead and run this under the computer account or the system account. That's going to run it, since we've already defined the computer account has permissions to that share, we'll just use that system account to run this. So this one would get automatically kicked off, and this could be essentially a replacement of that AfterBackup.bat that would be run in the site maintenance, and this would run automatically based on this scheduled task. So just like the other one, it's going to log out all the RoboCopy. So if we go ahead and look back at our backup folder, here we go. So this one is saving to the custom backup folder. So we basically have our first option, which used the site maintenance task. So that was the default site backup here. And then the after backup saved it to PR3 backup content. And then we have our new custom backup, which is going to be this folder here. So that's basically option 1 and option 2 here. And then in addition, we have our SQL backup that included WSUS, but we also just did a backup of the SCCM database. So this would be option 2 if you didn't want to use SCCM. So this could include both of those. So we'll wait for this to copy, and then we're going to go through the restore process. All right, so our backup just completed. So like we can see, really the only difference between this backup is that we just included that CD.Latest folder within the backup to this UNC path. So that's really both options. So we have our backups there. So what we're going to do now is let's go ahead and wipe this server. All right, here we go. So here's our site server. So instead of booting to our hard drive, we're going to go ahead and pixie boot. One of our other SCCM sites should go ahead and give this a pixie boot for our boot image. And then what we'll do, we'll just kind of reimage and format the drive. All right, here we go. So just within WinPE, instead of actually running a task sequence, just because I don't have one for Server 2019 now, I'm just going to use this WinPE to go ahead and format the drive. So we're going to go ahead and run a disk part. Then we'll go ahead and list disk. So we can see all these different disks. So we're going to go ahead and select disk 0, and we're going to clean it. So that's basically going to, we go ahead and do a notepad here. We can see that we no longer have a C drive, so we're no longer going to be able to boot this machine. So let's go ahead and log out here. And I'm going to go ahead and mount the Server 2019 ISO. There we go. Do OK on that. Start up here. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and just walk through the imaging of this device for this server. Now, if you did want to bring up a brand new machine side by side, you could simply shut down the other machine. In my case, I'm just going to reuse this VM. All right, one thing I do want to mention, when the new server is up and reinstalled, we do need to make sure that the host name is the exact same as the previous site server. So we're going to name that SCCM3. We're going to reboot and then go ahead and join the domain. All right, now before I join, I am just going to go ahead and clean up the old site server computer account. So this will join as a new fresh object instead of reassociating. Either option would probably work fine. So let's go ahead and join this machine. There we go. So SCCM3, we'll go ahead and reboot. So then jumping back over to my domain controller, we should see that we have this new machine here. There we go. I'm just going to go ahead and put it back in the OU that I was in. Now, we do also have a computer group for my SCCM site servers. This contains all the computer accounts for any site server. So I'm going to go ahead and add that new computer object within here. And then go ahead and add that. Now, if we remember, if you've followed any of my videos and you looked at the initial installation video, we assigned this site server computer security group permissions to the system management container. So that's going to be where SCCM publishes the details about sites. So since we rejoined that object into that group, we should automatically have permissions back in to publish any site data into the system management container. So this looks good. All right, so we are backlogged in. We are now on SCCM3. So this is essentially the new site server that we're going to restore. It's now running server 2019. So we're going to upgrade from our old site server running 2016 to 2019. The first thing that I want to do is go ahead and get Microsoft.NET 3.5 installed. Now I'm going to go ahead and do my alternative path here. So I do still have my ISO mounted for server 2000. So if we go ahead and open this, I still have it mounted for server 2019. So I'm just going to point out to the SXS folder that contains the installation for .NET 3. So we'll go ahead and install that. That's going to be one of the first prerequisites. And then we'll go through and get SQL installed, get IIS installed, and then get WSUS reinstalled before we perform our recovery. All right, so the installation of .NET 3.5 is done. I'm going to go ahead and install our IIS using a PowerShell script. This will also be included in the description, but this is just going to install IIS as well as the IIS role services that we need to install. There we go. I think I pasted that wrong. So that's going to go ahead and install IIS. While we're waiting for that, we'll go ahead and get the ADK started. So we're going to install the Windows 10 1809 ADK. Now we need USMT and the deployment tools. Now, if you want more details about the core installation, check out the initial video I did for setting up SCCM. I think it's the first guide in my series. That does go into more detail about all these prerequisites I'm doing and why we do them. But for now, we're just trying to get all the requirements in order to do the restore. All right, so that part of the ADK is done. Next, we're going to install the WinPE portion of the ADK. So we'll do next here, defaults, and we're going to install WinPE. Go ahead and do yes on that. Looks like IIS just completed, so that looks good. So while we wait for the ADK, the next thing that will kick off is SQL. But before we do that, I'm going to go ahead and bring all the disk online. So since we basically reused the previous machine, we still have all the disk that we had for the previous installation. So I mainly did that just to be lazy. So let me go ahead and just bring these all online, and they should have basically the same partitioning and the disk name as the previous server, since we only formatted the disk 0. So go ahead and bring these all on. All right, there we go. So that looks pretty good. So let's go ahead and take a look at this computer. And we see that we have a very similar disk structure as what we had before. Now what I'm going to do is go ahead and delete all of the content for all of the previous server files that were here. So we'll go ahead and get rid of all of that to make it like a clean machine. All right, so the ADK is done. We've now got all the content removed from all these disks. So we're now ready to go ahead and reinstall SQL. So we'll just do a similar installation. We're going to do the SQL 2017 installation. So I'm going to go ahead and walk through that and get that all installed in the background. All right, so the database engine service is now installed. Now we're going to go ahead and get the SQL Management Studio installed. So that is a separate installation with SQL Server 2017. So we're going to go ahead and launch that and get that running. All right, so the Management Studio is now installed. If we take a look back at the screenshot that we did before the recovery, we can see that we did also have the Reporting Services point installed. So SQL Reporting Services is also a separate installation from the core SQL 2017 install. So I did go ahead and pre-install or pre-download the reporting services, and we'll go ahead and get that installed as well. All right, so that installation is done. So we'll quickly run the configuration wizard. Just because we will have to define our web service URL. So we'll go ahead and apply that. Otherwise, when SCCM tries to reinstall the reporting point, if we don't pre-configure our reporting point through the configuration manager here, it will not be able to configure it. So we'll go ahead and see if we can create this new database. Now, if you did want to recover a database, if you did have custom reports, this is also the wizard where you can go through and choose that database that you restore. So we'll go ahead and create that. There we go. And then finally, we just need to create our web portal URL. And then we'll apply that. All right, so at that point we have SQL reinstalled. Now before we can install the latest cumulative update, which is cumulative update 12, I have installed that, or I have pre-downloaded that. We will have to go ahead and restart this machine. Otherwise, when we try to install the CU, it will say there's a pending restart. All right, so we're going to go ahead and install the cumulative update 12 for SQL 2017 just to make sure we're at that latest patch level. All right, so that is currently upgrading. Now, while we wait for that to upgrade, since SQL Management Studio shouldn't be part of this in 2017, let's see if we can go ahead and get that open. Actually, I probably will want to wait for this instance to upgrade before I try to connect to it. So we'll wait for this patch to install. All right, so that installation is now upgraded. So let's go ahead and connect into SQL. All right, so here we go. We can see that we have just the default report server database that we created. So what we're going to do is go ahead and restore the backup of WSUS. So let me go ahead and look back at our backups. SQL Backup, so here we are. So we're going to right click our databases and choose restore file or file groups. Our to database is going to be SUS DB. That's the name of the database that we want to restore to. And our from database, we are going to choose a file. So if we go ahead and browse out, we'll paste in that UNC path, and then we're going to select that susdb backup, the .back file. We'll do OK on that. Select that database to restore. That looks good. Now under options, it looks like it might have retained the previous data path, which I believe is correct. So if we look at the H drive, that is the drive that I dedicated to my WSUS database. It looks like it must have retained that from the backup. So that is in fact the folder that we want to restore to. So that all looks good. File. Then we'll do OK, and that should recover our WSUS database. There we go. So we'll refresh that. Now, for this scenario, we're going to go ahead and just restore directly the config manager database. So we're going to assume that we're using option 2, where we had our database backup in place, and we're just recovering using that database backup. So let me go ahead and copy that path again. Now within the recovery wizard, we will go through basically both options of what you would see if you were to do a site recovery using the default task or just the database only. So we're going to go ahead and restore this to CM underscore, I believe it's actually PR3 for this site. Let me just rename that. We're going to go ahead and add that backup file. So there we go. It is CM underscore 3 was our database name. That looks good. We'll do OK on that. Choose the database that we just added. Under the options, it's going to be adding our database file to the E drive and then our log file to the F drive. So that should be the same exact folder structure that we previously had. So our E drive is our MDF. That looks good. And then our log file should be going to F on the database folder. So that all looks correct. So we already have that same folder structure. So we'll do OK on that. All right, so the database is now restored. So that looks good. We do a quick refresh here. There we go. So that looks good. Now the next thing we'll do is jump back out to that backup folder. And within my scripts, I do have a custom restore script. So this is essentially the exact same as the copy script, except instead of the RoboCopy using the source, we initially copy from the UNC path to our local drive. So I just swap these two around. Everything else is exactly the same. So let me go ahead and run that. Let's run as admin. All right, so it looks like I had a small typo in the UNC folder name. So let me go ahead and try this again. There we go. So now we have RoboCopy. Let's go ahead and grab CM trace. Let's go ahead and copy that over. Set that to our default. All right, so now we can see all the data getting restored. So it's currently working on the content library. So it's bringing it back from that UNC backup and just bringing it back to this local machine. So we'll pause it while that goes through and creates that. All right, so it looks like the content library is now restored. If we look back on the J drive, it looks like it's currently restoring WSUS. Okay, it looks like that's already done. Now for the CD.Latest, I'm restoring that just to the D drive. So that's just going to restore it locally to D, and we'll use that for the reinstallation. And then the last folder was the sources. So while we have that already restored, I'm going to go ahead and share that out just because it was our shared path for our content before. So we'll go ahead and give everybody full control for the share permissions. And then for NTFS, we'll just make sure that we have our administrators, users, we'll leave that in there with read access. You could edit that as needed. And our system account, of course, needs control, and that looks good. All right, so the restore of content is now complete. I'm just going to do a few small memory optimizations just so we don't get the warning when we go to reinstall it. I'm going to set the min to at least 8 gig of SQL, and then we'll cap it to 12 gig based on this current server configuration. Now, if you want more details about this, check out my first video about installing SCCM. We go pretty deep into the specs of what we should do here, as well as all these different disk layouts that I'm using, and more details about why we do that. All right, now finally, we're going to go ahead and reinstall WSUS. So we're going to go ahead and do next here, next here. We'll choose WSUS and go ahead and accept any of the additional services that it needs. Now, we of course want to use our SQL database, not Windows internal. So we're going to choose SQL Server. For the content path, so we're going to go ahead and copy the WSUS content folder that we restored. So this has all the data for those third-party updates that we had published. So we'll do next here. Now for the database, we're going to go ahead and connect to sccm3.contoso.local. Now I do want to point out, in this scenario, we did upgrade from server 2016 to 2019. It's not a technically supported scenario from the product group to perform a recovery from a previous operating system. So if you wanted to go a supported route that's been tested, now I've done this a few times, it seems to work great. Even within the post configuration script, we can see that it detects that it was a previous version and actually runs an upgrade portion, but it's not officially listed as supported in the WSUS docs anywhere to perform a backup and recovery from a SQL Cert or from the WSUS running in a previous OS and restore that database to a new one. So if you did want to upgrade the OS like I did here and you wanted to go a supported route, you might be better just not recovering the WSUS database and just let it rebuild and resync with Windows updates. And if you did have any third-party updates, you would just have to republish those to WSUS. All right, so the initial config is complete. So we're going to go ahead and run the post-installation task. So if we go ahead and look at the log file for that installation, it's going to be in the temp directory for your user. There we go, WSUS post install. Here we go. So we can see that it's currently running that task. Let me see if I can find the part that I wanted to show you here. So it looks like that's still running. All right, looks like the post install completed. Let me take a quick look here. Oh, you know what? It showed it as a fresh install instead of an upgrade, because when I recovered the database, we can see that I typed sus bd instead of db. So let me go ahead and uninstall WSUS and delete this database. All right, so after the removal, it looks like there is a pending restart. So let's go ahead and perform that. All right, so we restarted with WSUS uninstalled. So I'm going to go ahead and delete the susdb that WSUS created. So we're going to delete that. Okay. All right, now let's go ahead and rename the WSUS database that we restored, but we just had a typo. So instead of BD, it should be DB. Wow, there we go. So susdb, that looks good. So now we're going to come back in here and let's launch our WSUS install. And this time it should go ahead and reuse that migrated database that we had backed up and perform the upgrade. So we're going to go ahead and choose SQL connection, browse out to our path. Okay, choose our SQL server here locally and then do next and then install. Right, let's launch that post install task. Go ahead and launch that log file. All right, so it looks like it is performing the install. Here we go. So here we can see that it detected the database already existed and it's going ahead and doing the upgrade. So even though it's not officially documented, it seems to work. But if you did want to go a truly tested and supported scenario, if you went from a previous major version of an operating system and you went to a new one like 2012 to 16 or 16 to 19, for example, and you had your software update point and WSUS installed on your site server, you would probably want to just start with a clean one. But just to validate things are working, let's go ahead and open the WSUS console and we should be able to see if we have all the synced updates that we previously had from that restore. All right, so let's look at just like any update and then any accept decline and do a quick refresh. So we can see we do have some of those third-party patches as well as some of the Microsoft ones that we had in our previous site. So this looks good. So in our instance, we are using HTTPS, so we will want to make sure that we go ahead and request our IIS certificate from our certificate authority. Now, if you're just using HTTP, this could of course be completely ignored. But if you do want to learn more about PKI within SCCM, there is a separate guide that I'll include there. But basically, we want to go to our template that we've already issued to our site server group and go ahead and request that. And we're going to go ahead and add our DNS alternative name for SCCM3. And then we'll go ahead and add SCCM3.contoso.local. Now, if you don't have the certs installed before the recovery and you had your site in HTTPS mode, it would just fail to reinstall the MP until you actually initiated that cert and had it enrolled. So now that we have our certificate, we will go ahead and open up IIS, and then we'll just get that bound to our default website as well as our WSUS website. So under the default, we'll go ahead and add a new HTTPS binding, and we'll choose that IIS cert, and then OK. For WSUS, I did also have my WSUS within this environment set for HTTPS, so we'll go ahead and bind that to port 8531 for WSUS. We can run a quick test just by browsing out https://sccm3. Since we included the host name as well as the FQDN, we should validate that it is in fact using that cert. All right, so that looks pretty good. So let's go back and launch our SCCM install. Now there's probably a couple of warnings that I'm going to get with SQL configurations being in native and SQL authentication mode. But for the most part, I think that we should be ready to reinstall with most of the prerequisites ready to go. So in our installation, we are going to choose the Recover Site option. All right, so these are where we have the options that we can perform. So let's go ahead and browse out to where we had our backup. So if you wanted to use the native maintenance task, you would essentially point out your backup for the site server to the backup folder and also for the database. And that's going to copy the database and install that to SQL. And it's going to also use the existing backup. Now, in our case, we're going to go ahead and choose to reinstall the site server because we're going to perform the SQL backup only and assume that we went with option 2. Now, we're going to choose to use a site database that has been manually recovered. And then let's go ahead and choose next. We're going to recover a primary site, and it's going to be sccm3.contoso.local. Let me take a look there. It said it was a CAS. All right, so this was just a little tricky for me. If we're just doing a primary site and you were not in a CAS, you can simply skip over this option, right? So reinstall the site server, use the database that has already been manually recovered. We're recovering a primary site. In our case, it was not part of a CAS, so we can simply just click next here. For this one, I'm just going to do the evaluation for 180 days. This is where you could re-enter your license key. Do next here, and then accept. Now I have previously downloaded, so if we look at the prerequisites and our downloads, this is where I already downloaded those just to save some time. So I'm going to choose that option and go ahead and choose that. All right, now since we went with option 2 to recover the site and do a clean or reinstall the site, we do need to basically specify the exact same site code, your site server, and the host name that was previously used with the site that we're recovering using that option 2 where we're not using the maintenance task. Now, if you did define and you wanted to use the maintenance task recovery option for that backup, it would just pre-fill in the site code and everything for you. In my case, our site code was PR3. Our site name was site PR3. And I'm going to go ahead and use the same installation directory that we had before. So that was D Microsoft Configuration Manager. Oh, there we go. So that's just going to reinstall it to that D drive. We are going to install the console. That looks good. Our site server is going to be just this machine here. Here's our database. So we should be able to detect that we already have that installed. Now, this does come up like it's going to recover the database. This should essentially be ignored, but I'm just going to go ahead and paste in the SQL database path for the MDF as well as the log file. But since it's already there, it should basically just read that, and that really shouldn't affect much. So we'll go ahead and do next here and look at the prereqs. There's probably going to be a few things around SQL authentication mode, maybe a few other minor warnings that I may have not configured. All right, that looks good. I think I'm okay with going ahead and proceeding with the current configurations. These are just warnings. So we'll go ahead and click on Begin Install. And we're going to open up the log file. So the C setup ConfigMgrPostRecoveryActions.html. And we'll kind of monitor to see if our recovery is successful here. So there we go. If we look back, we can just take a quick look and see that it was able to connect to the database, so that all looks good. There it is. We can see it ran a few stored procedures just to reset everything for the recovery. So this is looking good so far. Looks like now we're copying some of the boot files and the installation files. All right, so looks like a lot of the key components are now installed, but when we see that it installed the Site Component Manager, that's the component that handles the installation of all the site system roles. So if we look back on our SCCM log files and we look at the sitecomp.log, this is where you're going to see a lot of the other site system roles that are going to start getting installed. So for example, we can see that the SMS executive is starting to install. So this is where the management point, the reporting services point. So if you want to get more details after the core installation shows that it's complete here in a few minutes, you can monitor the site comp log to make sure that all of the site system roles that are being reinstalled in the components all seem to be recovered okay as well. All right, so we can see the core setup is now completed. So that looks pretty good here. So coming back to our sitecomp.log, we can see that it looks like we are currently installing the management point role. So the initial kind of post-installation tasks are going to be handled through sitecomp. So we can go ahead and click next here, and there are going to be some accounts that we need to manually recover the password for. So here we go. So here's from the recovery documentation. It's just saying, there's going to be some post actions that are going to be saved to the C drive. So things like re-entering account passwords, etc. So we'll go ahead and click next here. And here's our report of things that we would have to manually set the password for, and whether there are any SCCM hotfixes that would have to get reinstalled. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the C drive just to validate that HTML document is there. There we go. So that looks good. So we do know the exact accounts that we need to configure, as well as any hotfixes if that was applicable. So first thing, we'll go ahead and quickly get those set for us. So let's take a look and see if our console is here yet. Okay, looks like the console is up and running. So the first thing we'd want to do is set the account on that SQL Server reporting services point. So here we go. Here's that account that was defined. So let me just go ahead and click on New Account. And we'll just type in that same name, but then we'll just enter that password to make sure that we recover that password. Okay, so there's the first account. The next one is going to be our client push account. So let's go ahead and configure that. So that's done under Sites, Settings, Configure Client Installation Settings, and Client Push. Under the accounts, let's just go ahead and delete that. And then we'll go ahead and add a new account. And then SCCM underscore, was it client push? No, maybe it's just push. There we go. So we will go ahead and set that password. Click OK. And then the last account that we need to re-enter is the network access account for OSD. So SCCM underscore NAA is the account I use for that. So that's under site configuration, configure site components, software distribution, and then our network access account that would be used for OSD. So we'll go ahead and remove that, create a new account, paste in that account, and go ahead and get those credentials in. And then OK, and then OK. So that should have been the manual configurations that we had to do with restoring the account passwords. That looks good. Let's go ahead and open that up again. So those should be complete, and then we should be able to go ahead and close that. All right, it looks like a few of the other components are just finishing up now, but if we look at our MP setup log, it looks like the management point reinstall was successful since that was running on our site system. So I think the majority of the roles are back up and running and reinstalled. But we'll just kind of wait a few more minutes to see the additional ones that are coming through our site component manager and getting reinstalled, just to make sure everything looks okay and we don't have any failed. All right, so all the components have now been installed. The log files kind of died down. I did run a quick comparison. So if we take a look at our backup, let me grab that screenshot that I was looking at over there. Okay. So under our documentation, the UNC shares, so this is our pre-restore. And now if we take a look at our SCCM shares now, we can see that they pretty much align exactly alike. So we have our sources, we have just the default WSUS content that got shared out, as well as just all the native SCCM directories that would be included within here. So looking back at our console, we can see that we already have our clients talking to our management point, showing it as active. So this is a really great sign. You should have all your device collections. Take a quick look at our software update groups. We have our 2 software update groups we had. We should, of course, have all the software updates that show exactly the same. Same thing with any applications and packages. Just kind of verify that things are looking good there. And then probably the next thing, just kind of look at your monitoring and your site system. Just make sure that your status looks okay. There's no errors. And if there are, just make sure that it's not related to the restore that you did. So this all looks good. I mean, we've done our restore, and at this point we're back up and running in our site. So I think that that's really all I had to cover. I know this went pretty long, but hopefully it was helpful.